Gators Breakdown episode 97 is ready to go. Florida returns home 2-1. With Vanderbilt coming to town, can the Gators start a 3-game homestand with an important division win? I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And joining me tonight is Will Miles from SEC Country. You can find Will on Twitter at WillMilesSEC. Will, you joined Sunday night when we did our little recap, and you got a preview article coming out now. Should be tomorrow, I think, for SEC Country, previewing this Vanderbilt game. So you looked at this team a little bit, so we'll sit here and dive into that. We're supposed to have a guest on. If we can get him on, we'll try Seth Luttrell, but we'll try and get him on momentarily. But we'll see what happens there. So Will, quickly, before we get into a little bit of the breakdown, how important is this game for Florida and Jim McElwain?
Well, every game these days is important for McElwain and for Florida. There haven't been any that they've either been really close nail biters or they've been complete blowouts on the wrong side. So, I'm not sure there's any team you can take for granted, and certainly not this Vanderbilt team. The more you look at them and the more you look at how they played last year, who they've got coming back, this is a pretty formidable team. Derek Mason's building something there. Should they beat Florida? Probably not, but that doesn't mean they don't have the ability to do so.
That's right. So before we dive into the breakdown here, remember you can find all your Gators Breakdown episodes on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. Just search on those sites or get the links by following Gators Breakdown on Twitter and on Facebook at Gators Breakdown. Also, when on iTunes, please rate and review the show. Let Gator Nation know what they're getting with Gators Breakdown. So, Will, it's Vandy always gives Florida trouble. The last two seasons, they've given Jim McElwain a lot of trouble. Wins were 9-7 and 13-6. Some ugly games. Florida captured the East 2 years ago by beating Vanderbilt at home. And then last year, it was Austin Appleby's second start the week after Tennessee when they went to Vanderbilt. Didn't really necessarily look so good, but escaped with a 13-6 win. As you said it, Derek Mason has this team much better than where they were at his first year after he took over from James Franklin. He's really built this team in his image. They're a pretty good defensive team. Kind of fell off a little bit this year on defense. Ralph Webb is not the same Ralph Webb right now as we know. As Kyle Shermer's kind of carrying the offense right now. But this Vanderbilt team, even with Florida wins the national championship in 1996, one of their toughest games of the season was Vanderbilt. This is a team that's usually outmatched by Florida, but usually gives Florida everything they can handle.
Yeah, well, especially the last couple of years, Florida's had so many struggles on offense that you can sort of – if you don't score many points, then that's really playing right into Vanderbilt's hands because Vanderbilt doesn't usually have a juggernaut offense. And so, they keep it close. They hit one big play. I know, was it a couple years ago that Webb hit the long run that put them ahead in the swamp? And so, that kind of thing, you get one big play and all of a sudden you're up in a game where, field goals are at a premium. And so, I think it's going to be incumbent upon Florida's offense to win this one. I think this is one of those where, especially with the struggles of Florida's defense, we've talked a little bit about the chunk plays that they've given up before. They give up a couple of those and all of a sudden, you've given up 14, 17, 24 points. And the offense is going to have to earn this one.
Yeah, I think so. You're right. The way Florida has struggled on offensive plays really right into Vanderbilt's hands with them struggling on offense themselves. And, Ralph Webb is a nice running back. I think one of the SEC's best. You put him on a better team, and he probably is, even better than what he looks now. As I mentioned, Kyle Shermer, he's kind of been the leader of this offense so far. I remember last year, watching that Tennessee game where he just absolutely torched Tennessee, and he's kind of continued that this year. And carrying the offense. But, this team was riding high after upset. They beat number 18 Kansas State, who was ranked 18 at the time. But we know they got a lot of hype. CBS was in town in Nashville last week, and a lot of talk that Alabama's coming to town. Vanderbilt can keep this game close because of their defense, and then Alabama decides to play one of their best games, one of their best performances in the last couple of years with this Alabama team and steamrolls Vanderbilt 59-0. It makes you wonder what the outlook of this Vanderbilt team is since then. How confident were they going into that game? The talent gap really, really showed. So I'm kind of wondering what has changed in the last week with Vanderbilt's mindset after getting getting sky high after beating a pretty good Kansas State team, and then getting steamrolled by Alabama.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have had to overcome getting steamrolled by Alabama, and Vanderbilt's not really any different. So I don't necessarily know whether that's something that they're not going to be able to recover from, or that they're not going to be ready. I mean, it was a game they expected to lose, I would guess, going in. I think once it was 14-0, they pretty much decided they were going to save up their energy for next week. And I think they're going to come down to Florida with something to prove. I would say though that the idea that the Alabama game is an anomaly, I'm not sure is necessarily true. So Alabama rushed for 496 yards, but Kansas State the week before rushed for 201. So, with the success Florida's been having with Malik Davis and sort of, on the ground, especially against Kentucky, they really sort of showed an ability to move the line of scrimmage a little bit in that fourth quarter. You wonder whether that'll carry over. And that, I think, is where the talent starts to really play into, really starts to take hold is if Florida's talent can start pushing downhill a little bit. The last two games, Vanderbilt's gotten pretty beaten up on the ground.
For sure. And I had a stat going into that somewhere. Florida definitely, Vanderbilt allows 242.2 rushing yards per game and 5.1 yards per carry. So as you said, I think Malik Davis will definitely, hopefully find a groove in this game after he found a groove last week against Kentucky. And you would have to think Florida would lean on the run game a little bit with Luke Del Rio. The way Florida ran the ball last week and the way he came in and kind of calmed everything down, it looked like that helped the offensive line. There was some more communication there. It really does look like that still could be the game plan, because I'm not sure with what we've seen through 3 games and the previous 2 seasons. Right now, this Florida offense is not built on letting the quarterback go out there and carry this offense. It really is predicated on the running game.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a bad game plan going up against Vanderbilt. So if you look at Vanderbilt, they're 43rd overall in the nation in points per game, but they're 121st in yards per carry allowed, and they're 3rd in yards per attempt allowed. So to go out and chuck the ball all over the place with Vanderbilt just doesn't make any sense. They're not giving up a whole lot of yardage through the air. Now, some of that is Kansas State and Alabama have had a lot of success on the ground, so they haven't had to go to the air. But that tells you something, right? that Kansas State and Alabama are having success on the ground and don't even have to go to the air. Tells you that Florida should be able to do the same thing. I mean, Florida has maybe not quite as much talent as Alabama, but certainly I would say they have as much talent at wide receiver and running back as Kansas State. And that's actually the schematic thing that I hope we see on Saturday. Is I think Kadarius Toney needs to be back in the Wildcat a ton, because if you look at how Kansas State exploited Vanderbilt's defense, it's read option, spread. The quarterback ran the ball. Jesse Ertz, their senior quarterback, ran for 121 yards against Vanderbilt in that game. And while Jalen Hurts didn't run for a whole lot of yardage, the threat of Jalen Hurts allowed Alabama to put up all those yards. So, I'm looking for Florida to really make that schematic adjustment, that when they need big plays, when they need to put Vanderbilt back on their heels, to bring Toney back into the backfield and run some of those spread concepts with Toney and Davis, and potentially even mix in a throw there with the Wildcat as well. But that, to me, is how you attack Vanderbilt. Having Del Rio back there to manage the game, converts third downs, get them in the right protections, all that stuff is very important. But to have him chucking it, 4 or 5 times, taking deep shots to Tyree Cleveland, I don't think is the right way to attack this team.
I agree. And it may just be a methodical type of running attack that Florida brings in here. And as you mentioned, Vanderbilt, 4th in the nation in pass efficiency defense, giving up 4.4 yards per throw and only almost 117 yards per game. So, yeah, they're definitely playing the pass better. And as you said, it is a good point that Vanderbilt or Bama and Kansas State were probably playing more to their strengths more than not necessarily giving Vanderbilt the chance there to defend the pass. It was more they couldn't stop the run, so those teams were definitely sticking with the game plan there. It's a noon kick, Will. If Florida struggled with also noon kicks. So you're looking at struggling with Vanderbilt and struggling with noon kicks. So, it's a slow arriving crowd a lot of the time in Gainesville for these noon kicks. Just McElwain even mentioned it, in his post-practice press conference. We would like to not have to have these fourth quarter heroics. We need to start faster. We need to, to get off the ball. We need to run out of that tunnel, come in and start pounding the opponent right away. But in these noon games, it doesn't usually speak too well to that.
No, I think you see a little bit of an effect for these noon games. Like when you see teams come from the West Coast to the East Coast and they're not really sort of up, you can sort of tell. And I think maybe you get that in the first quarter early on. I think one of the advantages to the noon game is it's going to be hot.
Mm.
And so whoever can really establish themselves on the ground, I think, is going to have a real advantage in the third and fourth quarter, in the second half. I criticized the staff for going pass heavy early in that third quarter against Kentucky, and when they finally came back to the run, they were able to really put up some points. And I think the same thing will be true here: is if they're run heavy, if they stick with it, if they're willing to have drives that will stall, 40, 45, 50-yard line, eventually somebody like Tony or somebody like Davis is going to break one because the defense is going to get tired and because the defense has to deal with the heat of that noon game. So, it can be an advantage or a disadvantage. Obviously, Florida has traditionally struggled in these games, but Florida's traditionally played teams that they should have beaten at noon anyway, right? So whenever it's close, the narrative is that they struggled because it's a noon game, not necessarily because the scheme was bad or because their offense couldn't keep up or something like that. So I'm really looking for them to try to run the ball and wear out Vanderbilt, and use the depth that they have. I mean, I know we talked about the defensive depth being an issue, but on the offensive side, they can run in a lot of wide receivers and they can tire out those defensive backs. And they've got multiple running backs. I know Davis got the bulk of the carries against Kentucky, but they've got P. Ryan back there, and they can bring in Mark Thompson. Thompson did a really nice job with some of the blocks that he did in the Wildcat.
Yeah.
So they've got some guys they can run in, tire out the Vanderbilt defense. And I don't know who's behind. I don't know how much talent there is behind that Vanderbilt front line. I mean, obviously there's a lot of experience, but they're bringing in a lot of people to replace. I mean, they're replacing linebacker Zach Cunningham from last year.
Yep.
So Cunningham had 16 and a half tackles for loss last year. That was 24% of all of Vanderbilt's tackles for loss. And if you want to wonder, if you're wondering why they're struggling against the run this year, I would say that's why, because they don't have Cunningham. They don't have an NFL linebacker sitting back there. They're replacing him with someone who's pretty good, but he's not Cunningham. And I think we're seeing that in the run defense.
Right. I mean, Davis averaging 7.5 yards per carry right now, but you mentioned, I mean, yeah, they have talent behind him. And I like the way Mark Thompson's run this year. He's run, had some pretty tough runs this year. I like what I see in him. So Vanderbilt allowing 242 rushing yards per game, and they're giving up 5 yards per carry. I mean, I know fans want to see the ball thrown all over the field, but this probably really does play into a game where Florida can run the ball. Because, I mean, Kentucky going into last week, had one of the SEC's, and it's only 3 games, so stats are still kind of skewed early in the season. But Kentucky was playing pretty good run defense, and Florida in that fourth quarter was really just basically running at will on them. So that was nice to see from the Gator side. So when you look at Kyle Shermer, and I mentioned him, but when we look at the Vandy offense, through 4 games, 53 of 84, completing 63% of his passes, 721 yards, 8.6 yards per attempt. But here's the thing, 8 touchdowns to 1 interception. So this may be, another game where Florida can't rely on the defense to get turnovers, much like the Kentucky game where the offense will have to score points because, they're playing a team that doesn't turn the ball over a lot. So, Florida's trying to look at, maybe getting a pick 6 or, not many fumbles. Florida hasn't caused many fumbles this year. This may be even more on the offense because Vanderbilt really just doesn't turn the ball over.
No, that may be true. I do think the one thing to look out for with Shermer is that I'm not sure whether this season is necessarily a mirage compared to what he's done the last couple of years. They did play Middle Tennessee State and Alabama A&M to start out the season, and that's 7 of the 8 touchdown passes. So against Kansas State and Alabama, you got 1 touchdown, 1 interception. He 4 of 15 for 18 yards against Alabama. Obviously, that game was over early, but still, if Shermer had come out of there playing really, really well, maybe Vanderbilt stays in the game. And even Kansas State, I mean, it's 14 to 23, so not bad, but it was not like, the house of fire for the first couple of games. And unfortunately, Kansas State has had a bye last week, so you can't really get a gauge as to how good they are in relation to in relation to some of the other teams. Are they really a top 25 team, or are they going to be one of those 6-6 teams, that everybody thought was good at the beginning of the year and just didn't live up to expectations? So, certainly Shermer is now in his 3rd year in the system. He's got a lot of experience. He's played in big games. He's played on the road before, but you get smacked down 59-0 at home, and you got to start wondering about what's going to happen when you go on the road if the quarterback, I mean, you've got every advantage in the world when you're at home, even against Alabama. And, with as many complaints as people had about Del Rio and Appleby last year, I mean, Appleby played pretty decently in that SEC championship game against Alabama. Yeah. I mean, so if you're going to say Shermer's elite, and that's sort of based on the first couple of games, those were statistics, he's got to come out and play better than he did against Alabama.
Yeah, that is true. As I mentioned, Ralph Webb, all-time schools leading rusher at Vanderbilt, finally a senior this year. It feels like he's been at Vanderbilt for ages. I mean, I think Florida's played him 20 times now. But as you mentioned, 2 years ago, he had that big run that gave Vanderbilt the lead, and Florida had to kick a field goal with Austin Harden, to win that game when they were down by a point. 7-6, and Harden hits a field goal after he had struggled all season. So, and that wrapped up the East for Florida. But Ralph Webb, so far this year, only 64 carries for 169 yards. So he's only averaging 2.6 yards per carry. He's got 2 touchdowns on the season. We've mentioned the chunk yardage that Florida has given up, and to the running backs. Bill had a good stat the other night where yards per carry has went up for each team Florida has played, from Michigan to Tennessee to Kentucky. Now they're going against a running back who doesn't seem to be himself, has not set the world on fire like we expected. So Ralph Webb, he's going to come in, I think, ready to prove a point again. We know he's from Gainesville, and there's that chip on his shoulder. But the stats that you threw out against Kansas State and Alabama of Kyle Shermer, if Florida can continue to keep Webb corralled like other teams have, you have to like Florida's chances here.
Yeah, well, and this really comes down to, I think, the battle of both teams' weaknesses. So Webb's 2.6 yards per rush isn't really I think that's real because, even if you take out the Alabama game, it's not really all that biased. He averaged 2 yards per rush against Middle Tennessee State. He averaged 2.2 yards per rush against Kansas State. So he's consistently been in that range 3 of the 4 games, and the only game he wasn't was the one against an FCS school. And I think that points to an issue with the offensive line. And if you look at Vanderbilt, their 3 youngest players, their 3 youngest starters are all on the offensive line. Ooh. So they've got junior starters, Justin Skule at left tackle, and then Bruno Reagan at center. But they have 3 new starters. So redshirt sophomores Ian Pfeiffer and Jared Suthers are the left and right guards, and then redshirt freshman Devin Cochran is the right tackle. And so those 5 offensive linemen, they're all 3-star prospects. So if you have any sort of lack of cohesion, your one player gets out of position, you don't really have the talent to recover from something like that. I think one of the things that you look at when you look at offensive lines is, continuity and playing together and things like that. And these guys were on the depth chart as backups last year, but they weren't starters. And so I wonder whether the offensive line at Vanderbilt has taken a significant step back, and that's really impacting Webb. I mean, P. Ryan's a pretty good running back, and against Michigan with everybody in the backfield, he looked terrible because he was getting hit the minute the ball was handed off to him. And I think some of the same things might be happening to Webb. But conversely, on the other side, I think the defensive tackles, and Bill certainly brought this up, are an area where Florida has some concerns as well. And so those tackles are going to be sitting there right next to the guards who are brand new. They're going to have to win those battles. I mean, if you look at the Kentucky tape, even on some plays where Florida got wins, it was because of their defensive ends. So the play where Jabari Zuniga broke up the run at the mesh point between Steven Johnson and Benny Snell really set up a long third down that Kentucky couldn't overcome and had to give the ball back. If you look at what happened to the defensive tackles on that play, and in fact, everybody was going to be blocked if Zuniga hadn't beaten the pulling guard. And Zuniga beats the pulling guard and makes the play, and everything looks great. But if you look at the fundamental Florida defense, because they weren't getting any push up front, the offensive linemen were able to get out into the formation. They were ready to block the linebackers and the safeties. That was going to be a huge play if the defensive end hadn't made a play. So again, when I say it's sort of weak on weakness, I think the offensive line for Vanderbilt has struggled thus far, and I think you could say that the defensive tackles for Florida have as well. And whoever wins that battle, I think, is going to go a long way towards who wins the game.
Yeah, and we mentioned Florida's troubles with the chunk plays, but as I mentioned earlier in the week, they're still pretty good getting sacks, tackles for loss, and especially that play you just mentioned. Florida's got to get Vanderbilt into some bad situations here. Don't let them convert on first down. Don't let them get yards on first down. Make them play behind the chains because, I didn't necessarily know those stats that you were talking about with Shermer in the Kansas State and Bama games. So, those are teams of name, teams that have some talent. This seems like if Webb can't get going and you're making Shermer beat you, that probably will play into Florida's hands, and then maybe you can start forcing you to turn the ball over right there. So I think I like Florida's, and you mentioned the youth on their offensive line, and compared to this Florida defensive line and how big play mentality that defensive line is. So I really like that matchup, and I liked it against Kentucky as well. And once the fourth quarter got around and the clutch time came, that defensive line locked up for Florida. Kentucky got a little conservative, but I still think Florida's defensive line had a lot to say about that. This may be just the biggest mismatch on the field.
Yeah, well, and this is where I think Del Rio comes into play, right? Is really you didn't see those defensive tackles for Florida make any big plays until Del Rio finally got the offense on the field for any amount of time. And Taven Bryan was able to make a huge sack on a play against Kentucky in that fourth quarter to get the ball back for Del Rio. I think it was after the interception, actually, or it might have been after the touchdown to make it 27-21. But Del Rio had given the defense a little bit of a rest, and all of a sudden the defensive tackles were getting a push that they were not getting in that third quarter, particularly when Steven Johnson was just sort of sitting back there and picking apart the defense. So to me, that's where Del Rio really becomes important: is can he keep the defense fresh and allow the defensive tackles to make a play?
Yeah, for sure. Seth, I think we got you. I can hardly see you, but I think we got you.
Yeah, I'm in my vehicle at the moment. I had some really crappy service, so.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what I did to make this work, but hey, it works. So.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Glad you could join us.
Yeah, anytime.
Okay, yeah, we kind of discussed Vanderbilt a little bit, but you can definitely discuss the team much better than we can. But what's the thoughts of Derek Mason so far? We know the team was kind of hyped after the Kansas State win and a big time win. Especially for the SEC East and the SEC in general, getting a ranked win against a Kansas State team. But then, of course, the week later, the Alabama shellacking, and you know what? That's not the first team that Alabama has done that to.
Right.
So what's the mindset of the team after getting up so high, and then a week later, that happens?
I think that's going to be what ultimately determines the ball game. The last couple of years when Vanderbilt and Florida have played, it's been this really tight defensive struggle. There's been no room to breathe on either side. There's been no real offense on either side. I think last year it was like down inside. There was a fumble. I mean, it was sloppy football, but it was still fun. And I think the determination and emotion of this Vanderbilt team is going to determine how this game is played. If they can erase it and forget all about the Alabama game, that was a huge game. That was a huge opportunity. That was a chance for them to say, look, we're not the same old Vanderbilt, but they kind of blew it, which is fine, because in the SEC East, you know what? Everybody talks about Georgia, but honestly, in the SEC East, I don't know a single team that wouldn't get shell-shocked by that Alabama team right now. They're so good. I think the stat total said that they piled up 17 different fronts against the Vanderbilt offensive line, which is insanity.
Ooh. Yeah.
And it confused the offensive line. Barely got 100 yards of offense. And before the second half was even over, they pulled the starters. Which is good. Nobody else is going to throw that kind of depth at you. So if you can get guys reps, even if you're getting killed, if you can get guys reps, that's good. But I think it's really a tale of two different psychological teams, two different mindsets. With Florida, you have these emotions from, the Tennessee game and the Kentucky game. You won with two different quarterbacks, two totally different plays, still game-winning throws. Are they able to stay emotionally charged for a Vanderbilt team that's going to be looking to prove something again? And on Vanderbilt's behalf, how do you rebound after you lost to Alabama? Because let's face it, we said it at the beginning of the year, this stretch of games, Kansas State, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Ole Miss, was going to be the stretch to determine how good this team would be. But right now, they're 1-1. If they want to go bowling or potentially to an SEC East title game, they have to win these games. Whether they beat Florida, whether they beat Georgia, whether they beat Ole Miss, they have to win one of these three games. At least one, preferably two. If all three happen, then I might do cartwheels. But no, I think when you talk about Vanderbilt and Florida, it's an interesting dynamic because so much was built up on Kentucky's long streak against Florida that people forget Vanderbilt has not had the best success against Florida either.
Right.
It always seems like, really, truthfully, outside of the Urban Meyer era, it always, at least to me, seems like Florida has the better athletes. Vanderbilt normally has the better coaching. No, well, as I say normally, obviously with James Franklin and I think Derek Mason. I don't think Derek Mason's the better head coach, but I think when you talk X's and O's, he's a better schematic coach than you get with Nussmeier and McElwain and the group of coaches at Florida. And I think, fundamentally speaking, I think Vanderbilt's the better football team in this game. But at the end of the day, you got to play with who you have. And if Luke Del Rio is the better quarterback on Saturday, Florida's going to win. If the running backs are better, Florida's going to win. What's alarming to me about this Vanderbilt Commodore team is so much hype was made of Ralph Webb this season. So much was said, like, should he be all SEC first team? Should he be all SEC second team? He's got over 3,000 yards. So where should he fall in line with the SEC grades? Because he's played 4 years. A lot of them have only played 3. Everybody expected he was going to end up as a top 5 rusher before the year was over. And he's not had a 100-yard game yet. And you've played Middle Tennessee State, Alabama A&M, Kansas State, and Alabama. I mean, so really, you expected him to have a 100-yard game at least once. Now, obviously, against Middle Tennessee, he had 100 yards receiving. And against Alabama A&M, he was done in the first half. They pretty much said, no, you're resting. And then at Kansas State and Alabama, there was just no room. But, if Vanderbilt doesn't get a running game going, I'm curious to see how Kyle Shermer and these receivers react to the Florida defensive backs, which is probably the better part of the Florida defense.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Yeah. So, do you think that the struggles of Webb are attributable to him, or do you think they're more attributable to the offensive line and maybe some of the young guys who are starting there this year who weren't there last year, or at least were backups last year?
The offensive line for Vanderbilt, I don't understand it. And I don't know if it's the players. I don't know if it's Coach Norcross. I don't know what the situation is. Coach Mason thought it was bad enough that he challenged his team the other day in a live press conference. So obviously I'm not the only one that says, hey, the offensive line's really got to get it together. But, they lost Will Holden, got drafted by the Cardinals. I think he's starting now or is in the rotation with the Cardinals. And then they moved Justin Skoll from the right side to the left side, and they moved Bruno Reagan to the inside to play center, which blew my mind. I thought going into the year, if you were going to start a redshirted freshman, you were going to start Sean McElmore, the former top 5 center prospect, as rated by 24/7, that came from Hawaii. He redshirted last year, and I thought, well, if one starts, it's probably going to be him. Leave Reagan at guard, roll Bailey Grenier at right tackle, and just see how that goes. Unfortunately, what ended up happening was they moved Bruno Reagan to the inside, and now we got Ian Pfeiffer, and we got Della Ripa, and we got just a group of inexperienced guards trying to hold it down. Della Ripa and Sage Young are 2 of the newer guys, and they're still, JUCOs. So in theory, they should have more experience, but they are new. Like they've not been with this group. So, I don't know if they shake things up. I thought that was a big mistake against Alabama. I felt like when it was 35-0, if you were going to mail the game in, the least you could have done was throw the offensive line starters back out there and find a group that could work. Because really, to me, it didn't matter what front Alabama used or who they used. It was still going to be a test, and you could still find some good, valuable data from the whole thing. And they're going to get a test again this week. I don't expect Florida's going to lay down. I think Florida's going to challenge the offensive line, and if they don't move bodies off the line of scrimmage, it's going to be a long day for Ralph Webb again, and that's really something Vanderbilt can't afford.
Yeah, Seth, we moved to the other side of the ball. Vandy looks to be struggling in run defense right now, allowing 242 rushing yards per game, 5.1 yards a carry. Is it still trying to figure out how to adjust to the defense without Zach Cunningham? And Florida found a groove last week late in the second half, or pretty much the whole game, but really in the fourth quarter, Florida found a groove in the running game. Is that kind of how you see where Florida may attack Vanderbilt is trying to rush the ball on them?
If I were Florida and I was trying to attack Vanderbilt, that's where I would start. But even then, I would be wary of those stats because, Middle Tennessee didn't have a lot of success running the ball. Neither did Alabama A&M. Kansas State did okay when they ran the quarterback, and then Alabama just decimated it. So,
right.
I don't know. I don't want to say it's incomplete data, but I think you got to review all the film and understand.
Hey, Alabama does that. Alabama does that to a lot of teams, so it's understandable.
Yeah.
They skew a lot of stats.
Yeah, and the thing is, as good as the Florida running backs are, they're fairly young. I know they got P. Ryan, and there was a freshman I saw last week that ran really hard, really good.
Davis,
I really liked him. I don't remember his name off the top of my head.
Yeah, you're good.
But no, he ran really hard. The difference is you got a freshman and he's going up against Oren Burks and he's going up against Emmanuel Smith, and they're both seniors. It necessarily is Vanderbilt's weak on the run defense. I think they're not nearly as deep as they could be, because once you get past Nephi Lalau and Emmanuel Smith and Oren Burks, then you start talking about the young up-and-coming linebackers, the freshmen, the true junior, Jordan Griffin, Jay Hockaday. Dimitri Moore played last week. He was a freshman that just came in. I mean, you got some young guys in there, and I know Alabama really hurt the data, but even against Kansas State, a lot of those yards were held up off the tackle against the defensive end. So if they could run off Ivy's hip, I think that's where Florida is going to find their success.
Well, it did seem like Vanderbilt struggled a little bit with spread offenses last season. So Kentucky, Auburn, Missouri, and Tennessee were all games where they gave up over 175 yards each rushing. The quarterbacks rushed for over 50 in most of those games. And then certainly Ertz hurt him in the game against Kansas State. And then Alabama, I think Ertz was out of there before they had to run many options with him. But is there something specific about the schematic that Vanderbilt's running that leaves them susceptible to that sort of thing? Or is it just sort of an anomaly, you think?
I think what it ultimately boils down to is, even though Vanderbilt has gotten a lot bigger overall, you still look at their defensive line, and Torrey Agee's coming in at about 275 pounds as a 5-tech. You look at the depth behind him. Dare Odebi, I can't pronounce that name, or Dare. His mother's going to kill me because she follows me on Twitter too. But Dare and Dare, or Dare and Deo, or Dio, or I am really sorry for butchering these names. But those two brothers from Texas, they are fantastic. They do things fundamentally well. Dare is 275 pounds, 277 pounds, somewhere around there. And Dio is a freshman, and he's only 240 pounds. So you look at that, and you look at Alabama, and you look at Stanford. The difference is those 5 techniques from Alabama and Stanford, in places that play the 3-4 and have success, those 5 techniques are normally in the 290-pound range. So I think size is part of it. I also think that Vanderbilt looks for pass rushers at the outside linebacker spot. So when you come to Vanderbilt, you're a kid like Charles Wright, who's a pass rusher and has 5.5 sacks on the year. You're a pass rusher. You're not necessarily looking to make an impact in the run game. That's not to say he doesn't, because he does fine for what he is, but he is a pass rusher. he will get after the quarterback. He will come from the blind side and he'll try to get after Del Rio. But, the thing you give up when you put a pure pass rusher in is you give up the run stopping ability. And I think what Mason did really well against Kansas State was he tightened it up. He made some adjustments. He brought the safeties down. They wrapped Ertz up, and if you look at the stat totals, the quarterback run in the second half with Ertz was heavily limited. Now, will that change when it's Steven Johnson back there? Probably. Will it change if there's another running quarterback? It depends. I mean, I think the most dynamic running quarterback right now is probably Steven Johnson. But that's only because Josh Dobbs is gone and everybody else tends to stay from the pocket. So, I don't know. If I'm Nussmeier and I'm watching Vanderbilt on tape, I try to attack the outside linebackers. I mean, I know they're going to pass, or I know they're going to pass rush. So I try to slide in some draws. I try to slide in, things that are going to get them off kilter, have them coming up the field, wear them out, because the depth there is like, it is an inside linebacker. Andre Mintz, Caleb Pert, Josh Smith, all those guys are fairly young in terms of playing time. So if you wear out the starters, then there's a good chance you're going to end up getting some yards against some inexperienced guys. Is where Nussmeier can make the biggest difference.
Seth, you mentioned Nussmeier, and now we know Florida's on their third quarterback of the season. Felipe Frank started all three games. Malik Zaire came in and played against Michigan. And Del Rio came in and played against Kentucky. Del Rio is now the starter against Vanderbilt. What is there anything that worries you about this Florida offense? It is ugly. It's ugly at times. It's ugly for most of the game. They find a way in the fourth quarter, but what is it about this Florida defense that or Florida offense? I mean that you can't seem to get it going. You're a coach yourself, and you kind of know the technical side of things, and the way we don't really look at it from a coach's perspective. But what does seem from you? Is it just as simple as Florida doesn't have a quarterback? About this Florida offense?
No, it's as simple as Florida doesn't have a quarterback coach. I don't care how good Nussmeier was. I don't care how good McElwain was. Coming out of high school was one of the most highly touted passers I've seen in the state of Florida. For him, even if he's a redshirted freshman, for him to not be making some of the throws that I see from week to week in the Florida offense says one of two things. Either they don't call the plays to fit his skill set, or they haven't developed him enough to fit their offense. And both of those are pretty bad. I don't put any of the blame on the Florida quarterbacks themselves. I think Luke Del Rio was always going to be a game manager. I really like Malik Zaire. I actually thought he was the best quarterback out of the bunch. I thought he was the one that you could roll the pocket with, kind of take some pressure off the offensive line. He had the stronger arm. It seemed like, I know Franks could probably throw it farther, but it seems like Zaire can get rid of the ball a little faster. It comes out a little quicker. I thought Zaire was the guy that they should have really focused on. But what ended up happening was they went with Franks. Weaknesses showed in Franks. And now they're going with Del Rio. And Del Rio's good, but I think Del Rio is another guy that he could have been a lot better than he was, and he should have been a lot better than he was. He went to Alabama, he went to Colorado State, he went to Florida. He should be a guy that you look at and you say, okay, this is a guy that we can win football games with. He may not have 3,000 yards passing or 30 touchdowns, but he's a 3-star. Ideally, a 3-star can win you ball games as long as you develop them right. In terms of Franks, he reminds me a little bit of Kyle Shermer. Last year Kyle Shermer was really limited. He didn't do a whole lot till the last 2 games of the year. And everybody said, what's wrong? Well, what was wrong was we didn't open up the playbook. We didn't call things that fit his skill set. and he wasn't developed enough fundamentally, which is why Vanderbilt made the change at quarterback coach and moved Ludwig to coaching tight ends. So I think in the end, McElwain's going to have to ask himself, loyal to Nussmeier, that is fine. That's great. Being loyal to a coach is wonderful. It's one of the best things about coaching is you have friends and they'll call you, they'll bring you in, you have trust. But at the end of the day, if Nussmeier's not getting it done, and believe me, he is not getting it done at all, then you have to make that switch and move him somewhere else and let someone else coach the quarterbacks. I don't know who you would throw in that scenario. I don't know who Florida has that could be a quarterback coach. Um, for Vanderbilt, it was as simple as switching the tight end and quarterback coach. It was as simple as that.
It would
Because
probably have
when
to.
we
It
signed
probably have to be. Yeah, it probably has to be McElwain himself.
Yeah, well, and that's hard.
Yeah, it is.
An offensive coordinator coaching quarterbacks himself is hard. But when you get a head coach coaching quarterbacks, then it becomes even harder because your head coach is taking attention away from his whole team.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, with all the stuff going on at Florida right now, I'm not so sure that's the best idea is to have your head coach lose focus on the whole team.
Right.
And that's not to bring whatever, it is into the light, but it's saying, there's been some problems at Florida already, and McElwain's devoted his full attention to the roster. I can't imagine how that's going to look if he says, okay, I'm going to coach the quarterbacks, and then something else, breaks through.
Yeah, right. All right, Seth, quickly, before we let you go here, you don't have to give a score prediction, but just how do you see this game playing out on Saturday when it kicks off at noon?
I think that Derek Mason's going to have his team ready. I think that McElwain's going to have his team ready. I think it's going to be just like the last 2 years. I think it's going to be a touchdown game. Um, if I had to put a score prediction on it, I would say 13-20. I would like to call a Vanderbilt win, but that would be kind of homerism. But I will say this: I think out of the last 3 years, out of all the Vanderbilt teams that have played the last 3 years, this one is the best equipped to beat a Florida team, especially when Florida is down with the suspensions. Um, but let me also add this. If Vanderbilt does not come out in the right mindset, do not be surprised if this game is 31-0 Florida. If they do not, for lack of a better term, out of their asses, this game will go get away from them. Totally get away from them. Like not even close. And that's why Mason has had to reel them in. He said they had a full padded practice the other day, which is great. And it means now hopefully they come back refocused because this is a huge game. I mean, I'm not gonna mince words. This game could ultimately decide who plays in Atlanta.
Yeah, I mean, Georgia looks good, but they got that big game in Knoxville, and I think that'd be a tough game for them too. So, Seth, man, thanks for joining us here and sharing your knowledge about Vanderbilt, and we'll see how this game plays out. But I kind of agree with you, man. It's going to probably be one of those from like the last 2 years. Probably going to be another one of those ugly Florida Vanderbilt games.
Yeah, well, they're kind of fun. I mean, you sit there and you're watching. I mean, you don't have any fingernails left, but you're sitting there and like last year, the fumble in the red zone, it looked like Florida had Vanderbilt dead to rights, and
Right.
then they fumbled in the red zone, and
Yep.
it was like, oh, will they make it or won't they make it? So I'm curious to see how it goes. Hopefully, I won't turn the game off at halftime like I did last week and yell at the TV. So that's the goal. But I appreciate you guys for having me on, and best of luck to you. Hopefully, you guys come out of the game injury free. If Vanderbilt just runs over Florida, maybe you guys will fire a coach. That would be great. But no, I wish you guys the best. Sincerely, I hope it's a great game because I respect Florida's football program. But I think you guys would agree with me that they should be a lot better.
Oh, for sure, for sure, absolutely. At least on the offensive side of the ball, we've talked about it for weeks and seems years now. But they definitely should be a lot better, and especially on that side of the ball.
Yeah, well, I can't pinpoint. I mean, outside of Nussmeier, I can't pinpoint what's wrong. Maybe McElwain needs to hire his coaches better. But from a talent standpoint, Florida should never. If we're having a conversation about Florida and Vanderbilt being close in talent, there's a problem somewhere in development because the athletes Florida gets and the athletes Vanderbilt gets are two different athletes.
Yeah,
and that's why that's why I
part.
think ultimately, I think that's ultimately what is going to cost. And it's hard to say because McElwain has brought Florida to the championship twice. But I think with the scandal and everything else, that's why you're going to see McElwain let go and probably replaced by, I don't know, Charlie Strong at the end of the year. That's just a bold prediction. I have no
Oh,
insight, but
okay.
if it were and I was Florida and I was looking at South Florida right now, I would say Charlie Strong's the guy that I want.
Yeah, I think it's pretty difficult to let Mac out of there after this year, no matter what happens. But we'll see. We'll see.
I don't know if he's got Adidas contacts in his phone. I mean, Adidas, FBI. I don't know, man. Rick. It happened to Rick Pitino. Now it could happen to McElwain. It could happen to anybody. I guess.
I know. I'm just talking about. I'm just talking about what we know. I'm just talking about what we know.
Well, we're all hoping that
okay,
we're all hoping somebody in Tuscaloosa is the one who ends up with that kind of problem. But
yeah, either Tuscaloosa or Athens, or you know what? I was so mad watching Georgia the other day because I was sitting there and I was thinking, yeah, Mississippi State's going to put them in their place like Alabama did us. Yeah, let's go Mississippi State. Because I thought Fitzgerald was fantastic going into that game. And then Georgia punches Mississippi State in the mouth, and I'm like, oh, crap. They're going to be mad that we beat them on homecoming last year. And then we scheduled them for homecoming again this year. Like,
All
man.
right.
Anyways, you guys take it easy. I will hopefully talk to you guys later, maybe later on in the year. Or something, even if it's not Vanderbilt related, maybe if there's a coaching change, I'll come back and, tell you how much I like or dislike somebody or who knows.
All right. Thanks, Seth.
Thanks, guys.
Well, there we go. Bold prediction. McElwain's getting fired.
Yeah, that ain't gonna happen. McElwain's getting the fourth year, and I think that's pretty clear. Unless there's something else that pops up, and there isn't really any indication that's.
Yeah, everything we know, that's not happening. So.
Well, I mean, the suspensions and all that stuff are certainly a black cloud, but they seem to have been handled properly by the university. So, yeah, I think that one's probably a little bit out there.
He did say bold, but That's,
he was right about the talent, though. I mean, if you look at the talent difference between the two teams, Florida has significantly more talent from a star rating on 24/7, both on offense and defense. The area where Vanderbilt really has an advantage is in experience. So Vanderbilt averages considerably more experience, both on offense and defense. It's almost a full year of experience on defense. And so, again, going on the road, they're not necessarily going to be intimidated. I think that's potentially a place where Vanderbilt might be able to make some hay.
Yeah, and Seth would have made some fans out there happy because he's also one bringing up the failures of Doug Nussmeier in this offense. So that's a popular subject out there right now. Doug Nussmeier is not very well liked right now in Gator Nation, and a lot of people think Florida can do better there. So it's even out there away from Gator fans where other people out there are noticing the problems of Doug Nussmeier and his Florida offense.
Yeah, well, and I think this is actually a game where Nussmeier is really going to be able to put his stamp on it as to whether he's willing to make adjustments to fit his personnel. I mean, you and I already talked about Del Rio and whether we thought passing against Vanderbilt was the way to win. But when I went back and looked at the film, and I've got this in the article, it's coming out later this week, but there's a play that Kansas State ran, and it's basically a wildcat with their quarterback, and he busts off a 40-yard run, and it is the exact same formation that Kadarius Toney scored against Kentucky. It's the exact same play, the exact same everything, except the defense for Kentucky was actually a little bit better prepared for it. So, Vanderbilt, like he said, on the outside linebackers in particular, are not really equipped to handle that. And so that should give the running back, Mark Thompson, if he's the one who's in the game, an advantage when he comes through and tries to block that play. So, Toney, I think, is clearly the best player in terms of just explosion. I mean, when he gets on the field, it's a first down when they get him the ball. They got him the ball twice against Michigan. They got it to him 5 times against Tennessee, and they got it to him 7 times against Kentucky. So if that trend continues and Nussmeier keeps getting the ball to him, I think people are going to be happy with what they see, because every time Toney gets the ball, he's got a real shot to score. I mean, there was a play. I know you and I were texting about it. There was a play where he really set up his blockers, and he sort of slow played the play. Kentucky all drifted over to the short side of the field, and then he reversed field and came back the other direction. There were a couple of missed blocks, or they're difficult blocks to make, but there were a couple of blocks that could have been made, and had they been made, he takes that ball to the house. And so, you put the ball in his hands, and the guy's scoring touchdowns, he's throwing 50-yard passes, he's doing all that sort of stuff. I mean, Florida's best offensive weapon against Kentucky was clearly Toney, with an assist from Malik Davis. So, again, I think if you see Toney back in that wildcat, it's an indication that Nussmeier is adjusting, that he's not necessarily just sticking to the McElwain-Nussmeier offense, that he's making some adjustments to get the ball in his best player's hands. That doesn't mean Del Rio won't throw the ball quite a bit. It just means that Del Rio is going to manage the game, and Toney is going to be responsible for those big plays. And that, I think, is a way you can exploit Vanderbilt's defense.
Yeah, and those big plays probably need to come on third down, because we know Florida doesn't move the chains right now, but Vanderbilt's only allowing offenses to convert 26% of third down chances right now. So, Toney, Powell, if we can get some of what we saw last week from Powell, those two guys may be the guys you're looking at. Plus, also the run game. We know Florida has to get the run game going, like we saw against Kentucky, and like we talked about earlier, with Vanderbilt kind of struggling against the run. Only letting teams convert 26% of third downs right now. That's going to be pretty tough for this Florida offense that has struggled in that area right now, and struggled just in general. But now you got to probably start and look at your playmakers. If Del Rio can get this run game calmed down like you did against Kentucky, and the communication is there, and you're playing in third and shorts, and then there you go. Your chances are much higher. But if you got your 3rd and 6s and your 3rd and 7s, it might be where you see Powell and Toney, like you just said, when you mentioned his playmaking ability.
Yeah, well, and that was really the difference in the game against Kentucky, right? I mean, so Florida started out that game 0 for 6 on third down, but they ended up 5 for 14, which means they went 5 for 8 from then on out, and they were 3 for 4 on fourth down. So, they were able to convert. They were able to convert on 3rd and 4th down. They were able to prolong drives, and that's really what set up their ability to win the game at the end. So those obviously are going to be the spaces where Del Rio, I think, is going to be huge. Like the play to Mark Thompson to extend the last drive against Kentucky just isn't something that Zaire's going to do. And to be honest, it's not something Toney's going to do either. I mean, if you put Toney back there in the Wildcat and Kentucky had done something to sort of penetrate into the backfield, the play's over. And Del Rio was able to make something out of nothing. And I think that's where his experience comes in. So just like it was against Tennessee, I mean, Florida converted 50% of their third downs on that. I know Joey was talking about the Kentucky game and how good Kentucky was on third down. I tell you what, for the first 3 quarters, he looked like he was going to be spot on that. And then finally the 4th quarter came with Del Rio in, and all of a sudden they were converting him. And that's when the offense was able to score. So, I think you'll see the ssame thing, or I think you'll need to look at the same thing for Vanderbilt. But obviously first down is going to be important too. I mean, if you get to 2nd and 6, all of a sudden you can take some shots. You can still do some things. And then, McElwain was aggressive on 4th down. But a lot of that was necessitated by the situation in the game. Yep. But there were a couple of times where he was in Kentucky's side of the field where that was the right move anyway. And I just hope he continues to do that, because this isn't an offense. They may need to make a 4th down or 2 to put up a touchdown rather than a field goal. And, really, to me, if they can put up 17 points in the first half, I'm not sure Vanderbilt is going to be able to keep up. But if it ends up being one of those 6-3 first halves, even if Florida's ahead, you pop one long run and all of a sudden you're down and you got to get back into sort of desperation mode and the crowd's groaning and all that sort of stuff. So
one thing I hope we don't see is on 3rd and 6, a little screen pass to Brandon Powell with no blockers up there. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so that's actually an interesting one. They had run some similar actions earlier, and I think they thought that was going to be open.
Yeah.
Obviously they called it. I mean, they called it, and it was against the wrong defense, and so Powell wound up out there. But that was also what, a third down. So
yeah, 36.
Yeah. So again, they were sort of in that situation. I think, sort of what they did later. They threw a toss play to Davis on like a 3rd and 3, or I'm sorry, like a 3rd and 6, 3rd and 5, something like that, and got it to 4th and 1, and then gave it back to Davis up the gut, and were able to get the first down. So, when you go back and look at the tape, Nussmeier didn't do a terrible job calling plays in the fourth quarter. Really, my biggest complaint was just the run-pass differential. I mean, it was clear in the first half Florida had an advantage with the run, and they just refused to take care of it or take advantage of it.
Right.
Now they came out in the second half and looked like they wanted to, but obviously we talked last time about Franks and the running back going in the wrong direction on the opening play of the second half, and that sort of set the tone for what was going to happen for the next couple of 3 and outs. So.
No, I agree. Besides that play I just pointed out, you're right. When Del Rio came in, Brandon Powell was wide open on Del Rio's first completion. Then he threw the terrible interception. But then, that wheel route where he hit Powell and Powell stepped out of bounds, that was a darn good throw. And Powell was wide open on that as well. And it wasn't because he stepped out of bounds. He was just kind of inexplicably stepped out of bounds. But you said, once he settled in to calling the run and helping the defense kind of creep up a little bit. There were some open receivers that Del Rio saw. He also made the play to Thompson on that 4th and 3. But the two kind of plays to Powell, where the very first completion and the wheel route where Powell stepped out of bounds, there was nothing wrong with those play calls at all.
No, and that wheel route to Powell is interesting because they ran an action in the backfield very similar to the touchdown that they ran with Malik Davis against Tennessee. It was a very similar action in the backfield.
Oh, right, yeah.
Powell wasn't Del Rio's first option, but Powell was one-on-one with a linebacker. And so that was the right throw to make for that particular play. And so you had two things going on there. One, there was some misdirection going on in the backfield that got the linebackers sort of a little bit discombobulated, and certainly made the safeties sort of hold where they were. And then they were able to sneak Powell on a linebacker out beyond the linebacker and in front of the safety and hit him down the sideline. And obviously you can't step out of bounds there, but it was a beautiful throw and the play design was great. But one play design doesn't eliminate all the play designs that have been poor. I think a lot of times, though, you see play designs that look poor because they're not being executed properly by many different people. I mean, last year there were a couple articles I wrote just about little mistakes killing Florida, and it wasn't always Del Rio, it wasn't always Appleby. Sometimes it was the offensive line missing a block. Sometimes it was the running back missing a block. Sometimes it was the running back not cutting back the way it looked like he was supposed to. All those things start to add up over time. They seem to be eliminating those types of mistakes at every other position. And when Del Rio came in, those mistakes were gone. Now, he's still probably going to take a couple of deep shots, and he might throw it in some spaces where he shouldn't. But it's also kind of nice to see a quarterback who's willing to take the shot. And, at some point, you got to, I've been calling for it for 3 straight weeks. Go down chucking. So, if you're behind by 2 touchdowns and you got to come back, you may as well take a couple chances.
All right, Will, wrapping up this show, how do you see this game playing out? Is it another stinker from the last couple of years where Florida's escaping with a victory, or does Florida have a little bit of pad in between themselves and Vanderbilt this year?
I think what Seth said about not being surprised that it would be a blowout, I think that's accurate. I mean, we've talked a lot about margin of error when you and I have been talking about these games. And against Michigan, Florida had basically 0 margin for error. And I think against Vanderbilt, they have a little bit more. But the fact that it's a noon game, the fact that you're bringing in Del Rio and it's not like a spark off the bench, it's more of a, he's starting the game. Right. So it's not that spark. I don't necessarily know whether they're going to push Tony as much as I would like them to back in the Wildcat. I'm still picking Florida. I think Florida wins 23-20, but I do think it's a close game. I think Florida's defense is going to struggle a little bit. I mean, I don't think this is going to be something where they give up 400 yards rushing or anything like that, but I do think they're going to have some trouble getting off the field, that Vanderbilt's going to be able to bust a couple of either large runs, large passes. Ralph Webb, like Seth said, had 100 yards receiving in the first game of the year. He had 20 and 24 receptions the last 2 years, so I think maybe he'll be able to get out on some of those sort of John Kelly plays that we saw against Tennessee. And Florida, quite honestly, just doesn't have an answer for that right now. The linebackers aren't fast enough to take care of it, and the defensive backs aren't tackling well enough to be able to stop those plays either. And so, if they can get him out on the edge, they might be able to make some progress there. So I'm taking Florida 23-20. It wouldn't surprise me if it's a 31-10 game. It would surprise me if it's 31-10 Vanderbilt. And that's sort of, but this is a really hard one to call because you don't really know what to make on the Florida side of the Michigan loss and the 2 wins against Tennessee and Kentucky. Like, why is it that why is it the offense only shows up in the fourth quarter? Like, right. What's going on? And then you look back at Vanderbilt and the 2 decent teams they've played. Kansas State's played no one, so you don't really know how good they are. Yeah. And Alabama's a juggernaut, and you figure Florida probably would have lost about that bad too. But it's at home, at home, like, you ought to be able to keep Alabama to 40 points, maybe, like not 59. So I just really don't know what exactly. This is one of those where you're kind of like, last year Florida was considerably better than Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt's bringing a lot more people back, but the problems at Florida are still the same. I don't think the Gators are that much worse on offense, but I think it's all going to be determined by those defensive tackles up front and whether Florida can stop the run.
Yeah, I'm going to say a little bit of pad finally for Florida. I don't know if the homer in me this time or not, but I'll say 27-13. I think defensive line kind of just controls the game for Florida here. I don't think they let Webb go crazy. Now, you are right. Those running back screens and running back coming out of the backfield has been a Florida defensive killer for the last few games, especially not being able to tackle. And Garcia being a linebacker, he's just that's where you can tell he's a walk-on. There's these SEC style of running backs are being able to show why he was a walk-on linebacker. So that matchup there. But I just really like this defensive line versus offensive line matchup for Florida. I think they can kind of control the Vandy O-line. So if they don't let Webb go crazy out of the backfield, I think the defensive backs can control Kyle Shermer in the pass game there, not let those receivers go crazy there. And for whatever reason, I think the run game just takes off and is consistent. I think they stick with it this time. It will probably be boring at times for Gator fans again, but it'd be not as boring because it won't work. It'd just be a slow, methodical type of offense from the Gators this time. I think you'll see all 3 running backs get a pretty good bit of carries, but I do think Davis, once again, will lead the way. I think we've seen by now they trust him after the big play against Tennessee. Yes, it was a fumble, but he proved something there. They really, look, this was a game Florida needed to win last week. It's the fourth quarter, and you have a true freshman running back out there making the plays. They trust him. So I think they let him kind of just take over, let him take the running back one reps, get more out there from Malik Davis. I think we see some Mark Thompson and P. Ryan as well. But like you, Kadarius Toney, more in the Wildcat, please. We'll take it. It should be in McElwain's redo a contract where it should be 10 touches a game for Toney right now. So, I just kind of see with the Wildcat and how well I think these 3 running backs, what they can bring to the table against this Vandy defense. I just kind of think it's a methodical type of win for Florida.
Yeah, well, I think I can easily see it going your way in terms of score.
I can easily see it going yours.
Well, and I think it really boils down to schematic and what the fundamental principles of Nussmeier are. So if Toney gets 7 touches, I think we're probably more close to my score. And I think if Toney gets 12 touches, we're probably closer to your score. I really think it's that simple. That if you get the ball in your playmaker's hands often, you're going to score. And it seems like that should be simple, but it's not. It hasn't always been that way. So hopefully they'll do that, and hopefully it'll be closer to your score than mine.
Hopefully so. Well, anything else you want to put out there about your article that's going to be coming out for your Vanderbilt preview?
No, just look for it on Twitter. I'm certainly, I appreciate everybody interfacing with me. Hopefully Zach enjoyed his public sub while he was listening to us tonight. Mr. Gatorman has certainly been active tweeting us about the episode. So we appreciate the support and thanks for listening, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for listening. Everybody out there, we really appreciate the support. So I kind of just remembered, as numbering the episodes while we get ready, 97. So episode 100 coming up, kind of weird. So that'll be next week. We'll be hitting 100 episodes here on Gators Breakdown. So Florida has a home game against Vanderbilt. Can they get a home streak home game win streak going with some big games coming up. So for Will, I'm Dave. Thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.